Chapter 1. The History of an Interpretation. All ideas have a beginning. People who believe in an idea, however, are often completely unaware of its background, origin, and development. Ignorance of that history may strengthen the conviction that the idea is true, even when it is not. As happens in other cases, this ignorance may provide fertile soil for fanaticism. True, knowledge of the historical development of an idea does not necessarily disprove it, but such knowledge does enable us to improve our judgment of its validity. A clear example of an idea, in this case an interpretation, that is obscured by ignorance is a widely held concept concerning the Gentile times referred to by Christ at Luke 21:24. Quote, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken away as captives among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of Gentiles are fulfilled." End quote, from the New Revised Standard Version. Millions of persons internationally have come to accept the belief that this prophetic statement definitely points to and is linked with a specific date in the 20th century, and they even build their present plans and future hopes on that belief. What is its history? Subheading: The Year-Day Principle. The length of the period called the Gentile times, translated the appointed times of the nations in the Watchtower Society's New World Translation, has been calculated by some expositors, including the Watchtower Society, to be 2,520 years. This calculation is founded upon the so-called year-day principle. According to this principle in biblical time-related prophecies, a day always stands for a year, just as on a map, 1 inch may stand for 100 miles. In the Bible, there are two passages where prophetic periods are explicitly counted that way: Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. In the first text, as punishment for their errors, the Israelites were to wander in the desert for 40 years, measured out by the number of days the spies had spied out the land: 40 days, a day for a year. In the second text, Ezekiel was told to lie on his left side for 390 days and on his right side for 40 days, prophetically carrying the errors of Israel and Judah committed during just as many years: a day for a year. It should be noted, however, that these specific interpretations are given to us by the Bible itself. A day for a year is nowhere stated to be a general principle of interpretation that applies also to other prophetic periods. The development of the concept that the year-day principle can indeed apply to any time-related biblical prophecy has a long history. The shifting nature of its application during that history surely reveals something as to its reliability. Subheading: Its use by Jewish scholars. Jewish rabbis were the first to begin applying this way of counting prophetic time beyond the two references cited, as they did this with the 70 weeks of Daniel 9:24 through 27, the first verse of which states, "70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place." Despite this, the fact is that the year-day application was not stated as a general principle until the 1st century CE by the Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph, circa 50 to 132 CE. Hundreds of years passed, and it was only at the beginning of the 9th century that a number of Jewish rabbis began to extend the year-day principle to other time periods in the book of Daniel. These included the 2,300 evenings and mornings of Daniel 8:14, and the 1,290 days and 1,335 days of Daniel 12:11 and 12, all of which were viewed as having messianic implication. The first of these rabbis, Nahawendi, considered the 2,300 evenings and mornings of Daniel 8:14 as years, counting them from the destruction of Shiloh, which he dated to 942 BCE, to the year 1358 CE, and that year he expected the Messiah would come. Nahawendi was soon followed by others, such as Sadiya ben Joseph from the same century and Solomon ben Jehoram from the 10th century. The latter applied the year-day principle to the 1,335 days of Daniel 12:12, counting them from the time of Alexander the Great. He arrived at the year 968 CE as the date for the redemption of Israel. The famous Rabbi Rashi, from 1040 to 1105 CE, ended the 2,300 year days in 1352 CE when he thought the Messiah would come. Abraham Bar Chaya Hanassi, circa 1065 to 1136, speculated that the 2,300 and the 1,290 and the 1,335 year periods would terminate on different dates in the 15th century. The end of the 2,300 year days, for instance, was set at 1468 CE. Even up into the 19th century, many other Jewish scholars were continuing to use the year-day principle to fix dates for the coming of the Messiah. The methods of the rabbinical scholars used in applying the year-day principle during those 10 centuries were varied, and the dates they arrived at differed. Whatever method employed, however, one thing was true. All the end dates eventually proved empty of fulfillment. Since the use of the year-day principle is relatively common among Jewish sources from early centuries, was this also the case among Christian Bible expositors? Of greater interest, does the history of its use within the Christian community and the results obtained demonstrate a contrast, or does it follow a similar pattern? What has been its fruitage? Subheading: The Year-Day Principle among Christian Expositors. As we have seen, Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph had presented the year-day method as a principle back in the 1st century CE. We find no application of it in that way as a principle among Christian scholars, however, for the following 1,000 years. True, several expositors from the 4th century onwards suggested a mystical or symbolic meaning for the 1,260 days of Revelation. Yet before the 12th century, they never applied the year-day rule to those days, nor to any other time period, with the sole exception of the 3.5 days of Revelation 11:9. That period was interpreted to be 3.5 years by a number of expositors, the first of whom was Victorinus in the 4th century. This, of course, was far from holding to a year-day rule or principle. Joachim of Flores, circa 1130 to 1202 CE, abbot of the Cistercian monastery in Corus, Italy, was most probably the first Christian expositor to apply the year-day principle to the different time periods of Daniel and Revelation. This was pointed out during the 19th century by Charles Maitland, a leading opponent of the idea. And a number of works and articles, for example, in refuting those holding that the 1,260 days of Revelation 11:3 were 1,260 years, Maitland concluded after a thorough investigation that the system of the 1,260 years was never heard of till dreamed into the world by a wild abbot in 1190. Though many 19th century adherents of the year-day principle tried to refute Maitland's statement concerning the novelty of the principle, all their attempts proved unsuccessful. After a very thorough examination of all available sources, even the most learned of his opponents, the Reverend E.B. Elliott, had to admit that for the first 4 centuries, the days mentioned in Daniel's and apocalyptic prophecies respecting Antichrist were interpreted literally as days, not as years, by the fathers of the Christian Church. End quote. He thus had to agree with Maitland that Joachim of Flores was the first Christian writer to apply the year-day principle to the 1,260 days of Revelation 11:3, stating, quote, "At the close of the 12th century, Joachim Abbas, as we've just seen, made a first and rude attempt at it, and in the 14th, the Wycliffite Walter Brute followed." End quote. Joachim, who was probably influenced by Jewish rabbis, counted the 1,260 year days from the time of Christ and believed that they would soon end in the age of the Spirit. Although he did not fix a specific date for this, it seems that he looked forward to the year 1260 CE. After his death, that year came to be considered by Joachim's followers as the fatal date that would begin the new age, so much so that when it passed without any notable event, some ceased to believe any of his teachings. Joachim's work initiated a new tradition of interpretation, a tradition in which the year-day principle was the very basis of prophetic interpretations. During the following centuries, innumerable dates were fixed for Christ's second advent, most of them built upon the year-day principle. At the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, Martin Luther and most of the other reformers believed in that principle, and it was largely accepted among Protestant scholars far into the 19th century. Subheading: the principle applied to the Gentile times. As we have seen, Joachim of Flores applied the year-day principle to the 1,260 days of Revelation 11:3. The preceding verse converts this period into months, stating that the nations will trample the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Since this prediction about the holy city closely parallels Jesus' words at Luke 21:24, that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, some of Joachim's followers soon began to associate the times of the Gentiles with this calculated period in which the 1,260 days became 1,260 years. However, because they believed that Revelation 11:2 and 3 and 12:6 and 14 dealt with the Christian church, Jerusalem, or the Holy City, usually was interpreted to mean the Church of Rome. The period of the times of the Gentiles, therefore, was thought to be the period of the affliction of the church, the end of which affliction was originally expected in 1260 CE. Others, however, believed the Holy City to be the literal city of Jerusalem. The well-known scholastic physician Arnold of Villanova, circa 1235 to 1313 CE, identified the Gentile times with the 1,290 days of Daniel 12:11, converting them from 1,290 days to 1,290 years. Counting these from the taking away of the Jewish sacrifices after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE, he expected the end of the Gentile times in the 14th century. The Crusades were still being waged in his day, and Arnold linked them with the hoped-for expiration of the Gentile times in the near future, arguing that unless the end of the times of the Gentiles was near, how could the faithful people regain the Holy Land from the unbelievers? At the end of the 14th century, Walter Brute, one of John Wycliffe's followers in England, offered yet another interpretation. According to him, the times of the Gentiles were the period when the Christian church was dominated by heathen rites and customs. This apostasy, he held, started after the death of the last apostles in about 100 CE, and would continue for 1,260 years. This period, and also the 1,290 year days, which he reckoned from the destruction of Jerusalem 30 years earlier, had already expired in his days. He wrote, quote, "Now if any man will behold the chronicles, he shall find that after the destruction of Jerusalem was accomplished, and after the strong hand of the holy people was fully dispersed, and after the placing of the abomination, that is to say, the idol of desolation of Jerusalem, within the holy place, where the temple of God was before, there had passed 1,290 days, taking a day for a year, as commonly it is taken in the prophets, and the times of the heathen people are fulfilled, after whose rites and customs God suffered the holy city to be trampled underfoot for 42 months." End quote. Since the times of the Gentiles already had expired according to his calculations, Brute thought that the second coming of Christ must be right at hand. Subheading: Constantly changing dates. Time passed and left the many apocalyptic fixed dates behind, the predictions tied to them remaining unfulfilled. By now, counting the 1,260 or 1,290 years from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE or from the death of the apostles could no longer produce meaningful results. So, the starting point had to be moved forward to a later date. Groups persecuted and branded as heretics by the Roman Church soon began to identify the trampling Gentiles with the papacy of Rome. These persecuted groups commonly viewed themselves as the true church, pictured in Revelation 12 as a woman who had to flee into the wilderness for 1,260 days, the period of trampling spiritual Jerusalem. This view now allowed them to advance the starting point from the 1st century to a time somewhere in the 4th century, with its growth of authority on the part of the Roman Church. This adjusted view was very common among the reformers. John Napier, from 1550 to 1617, the distinguished Scottish mathematician and student of prophecy, began the period about 300 or 316 CE and came up with the end of the Gentile times in the latter half of the 16th century. More time passed, and the starting point was once again moved forward, this time into the 6th or 7th centuries, the period when the popes had reached a real position of power. George Bell, for example, writing in the London Evangelical Magazine of 1796, counted the 1,260 years from either 537 or 553 CE, and predicted the fall of Antichrist, or the Pope, in 1797 or 1813. Of the 1,260 years, Bell says, quote, "The holy city is to be trodden underfoot by the Gentiles or Papists, who, though they are Christians in name, are Gentiles in worship and practice, worshiping angels, saints, and images, and persecuting the followers of Christ. These Gentiles take away the daily sacrifice, and set up the abomination that maketh the visible church of Christ desolate for the space of 1,260 years." End quote. This was written in 1795, in the midst of the French Revolution. Shortly afterward, the Pope was taken captive by French troops and forced into exile in February 1798. Very interestingly, these startling events in France and Italy had to some extent been predicted nearly a century in advance by several expositors, the best known of whom was the Scottish pastor Robert Fleming Jr., circa 1660 to 1716. Surely many felt these major historical events had confirmed the rightness of their predictions. Because of this, the year 1798 was very soon quite commonly held among biblical commentators to be the terminal date for the 1,260 years. This view, with some minor differences, was also adopted by Charles Taze Russell and his followers, and it is still prevalent among the Seventh-day Adventists. Subheading: Political and social upheaval fuels prophetic speculations. The French Revolution of 1789 to 1799 had extraordinary impact extending far beyond French borders. Following the violent removal of the French monarchy and the proclamation of the Republic in 1792, new extremist leaders not only brought about a period of terror and chaos in France itself, but they inaugurated an almost unbroken period of wars and conquest, which lasted until 1815, when Emperor Napoleon I was defeated at Waterloo. The revolution's chaotic aftermath in Europe and other parts of the world excited intensified interest in prophetic study, especially as some of these upheavals had been partially predicted by expositors of the prophecies. Historians recognize the French Revolution as marking a major turning point in world history. It brought to an end a long era of relative stability in Europe, uprooting the established order and deeply changing political and religious thought. Comparing the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte with the earlier 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, and the later World War I, 1914 and 1918, historian Robert Gilpin says of these three wars that each was a world war involving almost all the states in the international system, and, at least in retrospect, can be considered as having constituted a major turning point in human history. Another well-known historian, R.R. Palmer, in discussing the momentous role of the French Revolution in modern history, says, quote, "Even today, in the middle of the 20th century, despite all that has happened in the lifetime of men not yet old, and even in America or in any other part of the world in which the countries of Europe no longer enjoy their former commanding position, it is still possible to say that the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century was the turning point of modern civilization." End quote. The resultant uprooting of long-standing European political and social institutions caused many to believe that they were indeed living in the last days. Men of many backgrounds, ministers, politicians, lawyers, and laymen, became involved in prophetic study. A voluminous body of literature on the prophecies was produced. Numerous prophetic periodicals were started, and prophetic conferences were held on both sides of the Atlantic. The apocalyptic revival commenced in England, but soon spread to the European continent and the United States of America, where in the latter case it culminated in the well-known Millerite movement. Based on interpretations of Daniel 8:14, the predictions now developed generally pointed to 1843, 1844, or 1847 as the time for Christ's second advent. Quote, "It was in this feverish atmosphere that a new interpretation of the Gentile times was born, in which, for the first time, the oft-used figure of 1,260 years was doubled to 2,520 years." End quote. The chart presented on the facing page shows the results that the year-day method of counting prophetic time periods produced over a period of 7 centuries. Though almost all of the 36 scholars and prophetic expositors listed were working from the same basic scriptural text, referring to 1,260 days. Very rarely did they agree on the same starting and ending points for the period's fulfillment. The ending dates for the Gentile times set by them or their followers ran all the way from 1260 CE to 2016 CE, yet all of them advanced what to them were cogent reasons for arriving at their dates. What results now came from the doubling of this figure in connection with Jesus' statement about the Gentile times. Subheading: John Aquila Brown. In the long history of prophetic speculation, John Aquila Brown in England plays a notable role. Although no biographical data on Brown has been found so far, he strongly influenced the apocalyptic thinking of his time. He was the first expositor who applied the supposed 2,300-year days of Daniel 8:14 so that they ended in 1843 or later 1844. This became a key date of the Second Advent movement. He was also the first who arrived at a prophetic time period of 2,520 years. Brown's calculation of 2,520 years was based on his exposition of the 7 times contained in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the chopped down tree in Daniel chapter 4. It was first published in 1823 in his 2-volume work, The Eventide, or Last Triumph of the Blessed and Only Potentate, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He specifically states that he was the first to write on the subject. Quote, although many large and learned volumes have been written on prophetical subjects during a succession of ages, yet having never seen the subject on which I am about to offer some remarks touched upon by any author, I commend it to the attention of the reader, not doubtingly, indeed, but with strong confidence that it will be found still further to corroborate the scale of the prophetical periods assumed as the basis of the fulfillment of prophecy. End quote. In his interpretation, Brown differed from other later expositors in that he nowhere connects the 7 times of Nebuchadnezzar's dream with the 7 times of prophetic punishment directed against Israel at Leviticus 26:12-28. Nebuchadnezzar was a type, Brown wrote, of the 3 successive kingdoms which were to arise. Of the 7 times or years of Nebuchadnezzar's affliction, he said, these would therefore be considered as a grand week of years, forming a period of 2,520 years, and embracing the duration of the 4 tyrannical monarchies, at the close of which they are to learn, like Nebuchadnezzar, by the season and time of the 2 judgments, that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. End quote. Brown calculated 2,520 years as running from the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, 604 BCE, to the year 1917, when the full glory of the kingdom of Israel shall be perfected. Brown did not himself associate this period with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. Nonetheless, his calculation for the 2,520 years, and his having based these on Daniel chapter 4, have since played a key role in certain modern interpretations of those Gentile times. Subheading: the 2,520 years linked with the Gentile times. It was not long before other expositors began identifying the new calculation of 2,520 years with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. But even as with the 1,260 days, they came up with differing results. At the Albury Park prophetic conferences held annually at Albury near Guildford, south of London, England, from 1826 to 1830, the times of the Gentiles was one of the topics considered. Right from the first discussions in 1826, they were connected with the 2,520 year period by William Cunningham. He chose as his starting point the year when the 10 tribes were carried into captivity by Shalmaneser, which he dated to 728 BCE, thus arriving at 1792 CE as their last or termination date, a date that by then was already in the past. Many biblical commentators counted the 7 times of the Gentiles from the captivity of Manasseh, which they dated to 677 BCE. This was obviously done so that the Gentile times would end at the same time already being assigned to the 2,300 day years, that is, in 1843 or 1844. In 1835, William W. Pym published his work A Word of Warning in the Last Days, in which he ended the 7 times in 1847. Interestingly, he builds his calculation of the 2,520 years of Gentile times on the 7 times mentioned in Leviticus 26, as well as the 7 times of Daniel 4. Quote, in other words, the judgments threatened by Moses, which should last during the 7 times, or 2,520 years, and the judgments revealed to Daniel, which should come to an end by the cleansing of the sanctuary after a portion of the greater number, 2,520. End quote. Others, however, were looking forward to the year 1836 CE, a year fixed on entirely different grounds by the German theologian J.A. Bengel from 1687 to 1752. And they tried to end the 7 times in that same year. Illustrating the state of flux existing, Edward Bickersteth, evangelical rector of Wotton, Hertfordshire, tried different starting points for the 7 times of the Gentiles, coming up with 3 different ending dates. Quote, if we reckon the captivity of Israel as commencing in 727 before Christ, Israel's first captivity under Salmaneser, it would terminate in 1793 when the French Revolution broke out. And if 677 before Christ, their captivity under Esarhaddon, the same period when Manasseh, king of Judah, was carried into captivity, it would terminate in 1843. Or if reckoned from 602 before Christ, which was the final dethronement of Jehoiakim by Nebuchadnezzar, it would terminate in 1918. All these periods may have a reference to corresponding events at their termination and are worthy of serious attention. End quote. One of the best known and most learned millenarians of the 19th century was Edward Bishop Elliot, incumbent of St. Mark's Church in Brighton, England. With him, the date of 1914 first receives mention. In his monumental treatise, Ora Apocalypticae, or Hours with the Apocalypse, he first reckoned the 2,520 years from 727 BCE to 1793 CE, but added, of course, if calculated from Nebuchadnezzar's own ascension and invasion of Judah, BC 606, the end is much later, being AD 1914, just 1/2 century or Jubilean period from our probable date of the opening of the millennium, which he had fixed to about AD 1862. One factor that should be noted here is that in Eliot's chronology, 606 BCE was the accession year of Nebuchadnezzar, while in the later chronology of Nelson H. Barber and Charles T. Russell, 606 BCE was the date assigned for Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem in his 18th year. Subheading, the Millerite Movement. The leading British works on prophecy were extensively reprinted in the United States and strongly influenced many American writers on the subject. These included the well-known Baptist preacher William Miller and his associates, who pointed forward to 1843 as the date of Christ's second coming. It is estimated that at least 50,000 and perhaps as many as 200,000 people eventually embraced Miller's views. Virtually every position they held on the different prophecies had been taught by other past or contemporary expositors. Miller was simply following others in ending the Gentile times in 1843. At the first General Conference held in Boston, Massachusetts on October 14 and 15, 1840, one of Miller's addresses dealt with biblical chronology. He placed the 7 times, or 2,520 years, as extending from 677 BCE to 1843 CE. The second coming of Christ was expected no later than 1844. The date predicted for so long and by so many, with claimed biblical backing, came and went, with nothing to fulfill the expectations based on it. After the great disappointment of 1844, some, and among them Miller himself, openly confessed that the time was a mistake. Others, however, insisted that the time itself was right, but the events anticipated was wrong, expressing what has become a familiar justification that they had expected the wrong thing at the right time. This position was taken by a group which later came to be known as the Seventh-day Adventists. They declared that Jesus, instead of descending to earth in 1844, entered the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary as mankind's great high priest to introduce the antitypical Atonement Day. This group, which separated from the rest of the Second Adventists in the end of the 1840s, caused the first major division within the original movement. Some leading Millerites who also held to the 1844 date, among them Apollos Hale, Joseph Turner, Samuel Snow, and Barnett Matthias, claimed that Jesus had indeed come as the bridegroom in 1844, although spiritually and invisibly, not impersonally descending from heaven, but taking the throne spiritually. In 1844, they declared the kingdom of this world had been given to Christ. Subheading 8 Offshoots of the Millerite movement. Thus, following 1844, the Millerite Second Advent movement gradually broke into several Adventist groups. A proliferation of new dates began to appear: 1845, 1846, 1847, 1850, 1851, 1852, 53, 54, 66, 67, 68, 70, 73, 75, and so on. And these dates, each having their promoters and adherents, contributed to even greater fragmentation. A leading Second Adventist, Jonathan Cummings, declared in 1852 that he had received a new light on the chronology, and that the Second Advent was to be expected in 1854. Many Millerites joined Cummings, and in January 1854 they started a new periodical, The World's Crisis, an advocacy of the new date. Other factors besides dates began to play a role in the composition of the Second Advent movement. Right up to the present time, they appear as distinctive features among a number of movements that developed from Second Adventism, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, and certain Church of God denominations. These factors included the doctrine of conditional, not inherent, immortality of the soul, with its corollary tenet that the ultimate destiny of those who are rejected by God is destruction or annihilation, not conscious torment. The Trinitarian belief also became an issue among some sectors of the Second Adventists. For further details on these developments and their effect in contributing to division among the offshoots of the Millerite movements, see the appendix for Chapter 1. Most of these developments had already taken place by the time that Charles Taze Russell, still in his teenage years, began the formation of a Bible study group in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. From the end of the 1860s onward, Russell increasingly got into touch with some of the Second Adventist groups which developed. He established close connections with certain of their ministers and read some of their papers, including George Storr's Bible Examiner. Gradually, he and his associates took over many of their central teachings, including their conditionalist and anti-Trinitarian positions, and most of their age-to-come views. Finally, in 1876, Russell also adopted a revised version of their chronological system, which implied that the 2,520 years of Gentile times would expire in 1914. In all essential respects, therefore, Russell's Bible student movement may be described as yet another offshoot of the Millerite movement. What, then, was the most direct source of the chronological system that Russell, the founder of the Watchtower movement, adopted, including not only the 2,520-year period for the Gentile times, its ending in 1914, but also the year 1874 for the start of an invisible presence by Christ? That source was a man named Nelson H. Barber. Subheading Nelson H. Barber. Nelson H. Barber was born near Auburn, New York in 1824. He joined the Millerite movement in 1843 at the age of 19. He lost his religion completely after the Great Disappointment in 1844 and went to Australia, where he became a miner during the gold rush there. Then, in 1859, he returned to America by way of London, England. In a retrospect, Barber tells how his interest in the prophetic time periods was again aroused during this voyage. Quote, "The vessel left Australia with an Advent brother, Barber himself, on board, who had lost his religion, and been for many years in total darkness. To while away the monotony of a long sea voyage, an English chaplain proposed a systematic reading of the prophecies, to which the brother readily assented, for having been a Millerite in former years, he knew right well there were arguments it would puzzle the chaplain to answer, even though the time had passed." End quote. During this reading, Barber thought he discovered the crucial error in Miller's reckoning. Why did Miller begin the 1,260 year days of Revelation 11 in 538 CE, and start the 1,290 and 1,335 year days of Daniel 12 30 years earlier in 508 CE? Should not all three periods start at the same date? Then the 1,290 years would end in 1828, and the 1,335 years in not 1843, but 1873. On arriving in London in 1860, he went to the library of the British Museum, and among many other extensive works on the prophecies found Eliot's Ora Apocalyptica, in which Eliot reproduced a table, the scripture chronology of the world, prepared by his friend, Reverend Christopher Bowen. The table showed that 5,979 years since man's creation ended in 1851. Adding 21 years to the 5,979 years, Barber discovered that 6,000 years would end in 1873. This he saw as a remarkable and stirring confirmation of his own calculation of the 1,335-year period. On returning to the United States, Barber tried to interest other Second Adventists in his new date for the coming of the Lord. From 1868 onward, he began to preach and publish his findings. A number of his articles on chronology were published in The World's Crisis and The Advent Christian Times, the two leading papers of the Advent Christian Association. In 1870, he also published the 100-page pamphlet Evidences for the Coming of the Lord in 1873, or The Midnight Cry, the second edition of which has been quoted above. In 1873, he started a monthly of his own called The Midnight Cry and Herald of the Morning, the circulation of which within 3 months ran up to 15,000 copies. When the target year of 1873 had nearly passed, Barber advanced the time of the Second Advent to the autumn of 1874, but when that year too came and went, Barber and his followers experienced great concern. When 1874 came, and there was no outward sign of Jesus in the literal clouds and in a fleshly form, there was a general re-examination of all the arguments upon which the midnight cry was made, and when no fault or flaw could be found, it led to the critical examination of the Scriptures, which seemed to bear on the manner of Christ's coming, and it was soon discovered the expectation of Jesus in the flesh at the second coming was the mistake. End quote. Subheading: An Invisible Presence. One of the readers of the Midnight Cry, B.W. Keith, later one of the contributors to Zion's Watchtower, had been reading carefully Matthew chapter 24, using the emphatic diaglott, a new and very exact word-for-word translation of the New Testament, translated and published by Benjamin Wilson in 1864. When he came to the 37th and 39th verses, he was much surprised to find that it read as follows: For as the days of Noah, thus will be the presence of the Son of Man. Keith thus found the Greek word parousia, usually translated coming, here translated as presence. A widely held idea among expositors at this time was that Christ's second coming would take place in 2 stages, the first of which would be invisible. Could it be that Jesus had come in the fall of 1874, though invisible, and been invisibly present since then? To Barber, this explanation not only seemed attractive, but as he and his associates could find no faults with their calculations, they saw in it the solution to their problem. The date was right, although their expectations had been wrong. Once again, it was seen as a case of having expected the wrong thing at the right time. It was evident, then, that though the manner in which they had expected Jesus was in error, yet the time, as indicated by the midnight cry, was correct, and that the bridegroom came in the autumn of 1874. That was a quote. Most readers of the Midnight Cry and Herald of the Morning magazine, however, could not accept this explanation, and the 15,000 readers rapidly dwindled to about 200. Barber himself was convinced that the millennial morning had already begun to dawn, and therefore he thought that the Midnight Cry no longer was a suitable name for his paper. He remarked, "Will someone inform me how a midnight cry can be made in the morning?" The paper, which had ceased publication in October 1874, was therefore restarted in June 1875 as the Herald of the Morning, thereby dispensing with the first part of the earlier title. In one of the very first issues, September of 1875, Barber published his calculations of the Gentile times, making them terminate in 1914 CE. Subheading: Charles Taze Russell. In 1870, as an 18-year-old businessman in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, Charles Taze Russell, together with his father Joseph and some friends, formed a class for Bible study. The group was formed as an outgrowth of Russell's contacts with some of the former Millerites mentioned above, especially Jonas Wendell, George Storrs, and George Stetson. Wendell, a preacher from the Advent Christian Church in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, had visited Allegheny in 1869 and by chance Russell went to one of his meetings and was strongly impressed by Wendell's criticism of the hellfire doctrine. Russell had been brought up a Calvinist, but had recently broken with this religious background because of his doubts in the predestination of the 2,520 years and hellfire doctrines. He was in a serious religious crisis at the time, and even questioned if the Bible really was the Word of God. His meeting with Wendell and his subsequent reading of Storr's magazine, The Bible Examiner, restored his faith in the Bible. Articles published in the magazine seem to have been regularly discussed in Russell's study group. Although Russell knew that some Adventists, including Jonas Wendell, expected Christ in 1873, he himself rejected the whole concept of time settings and fixing of dates. Then in 1876, he began to alter his position. Quote, "It was about January 1876 that my attention was specially drawn to the subject of prophetic time as it relates to these doctrines and hopes. It came about in this way. I received a paper called The Herald of the Morning, sent by its editor, Mr. N.H. Barber." End quote. Russell states he was surprised to find that Barber's group had come to the same conclusion as his own group about the manner of Christ's return, that it would be thief-like and not in flesh, but as a spirit being invisible to men. Russell at once wrote to Barber about the chronology, and later in 1876 he arranged to meet him in Philadelphia, where Russell had business engagements that summer. Russell wanted Barber to show him, if he could, that the prophecies indicated 1874 as the date at which the Lord's presence and the harvest began. "He came," says Russell, "and the evidence satisfied me." It is apparent that during these meetings Russell accepted not only the 1874 date, but all of Barber's time calculations, including his calculation of the Gentile times. While still in Philadelphia, Russell wrote an article entitled "Gentile Times, When Do They End?", which was published in George Storr's periodical, The Bible Examiner, in the October 1876 issue. Referring to the 7 times of Leviticus 26, 28, and 33, and Daniel 4 on page 27 of the Examiner, he determines the length of the Gentile times to be 2,520 years, which began in 606 BCE and would end in 1914 CE, precisely the same dates Barber had arrived at and had begun publishing a year earlier in 1875. Subheading, Looking Forward to 1914. What exactly would the end of the Gentile times mean for mankind? Although monumental events relating to Christ's return were proclaimed to have taken place in 1874, these were all said to be invisible, occurring in the spirit realm unseen by human eyes. Would 1914 and the termination of the Gentile times be the same? Or would it bring visible, tangible change for the earth and for human society on it? In the book, The Time is at Hand, published in 1889, later referred to as Volume 2 of Studies in the Scriptures, Russell stated that there was Bible evidence proving that the 1914 date will be the farthest limit of the rule of imperfect men. What would be the consequences of this? Russell enumerated his expectations for 1914 in 7 points. Firstly, that at that date the kingdom of God will have obtained full universal control, and that it will then be set up or firmly established in the earth. Secondly, it will prove that he whose right it is thus to take dominion will be present as earth's new ruler. Thirdly, it will prove that sometime before the end of AD 1914, the last member of the divinely recognized Church of Christ, the royal priesthood, the body of Christ, will be glorified with the head. Fourthly, it will prove that from that time forward Jerusalem shall no longer be trodden down of the Gentiles, but shall arise from the dust of divine disfavor to honor, because the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled or completed. Fifthly, it will prove that by that date, or sooner, Israel's blindness will begin to be turned away, because their blindness in part was to continue only until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Sixthly, it will prove that the great time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, will reach its culmination in a worldwide reign of anarchy, and the new heavens and new earth with their peaceful blessings will begin to be recognized by trouble-tossed humanity. Seventhly, it will prove that before that date, God's kingdom, organized in power, will be in the earth and then smite and crush the Gentile image, and fully consume the power of these kings. These were indeed very daring predictions. Did Russell really believe that all these remarkable things would come true within the next 25 years? Yes, he did. In fact, he believed his chronology to be God's chronology, not just his own. In 1894, he wrote of the 1914 date, quote, "We see no reason for changing the figures, nor could we change them if we could. There we believe God's dates, not ours. But bear in mind that the end of 1914 is not the date for the beginning, but for the end of the time of trouble." End quote. Thus it was thought that the time of trouble was to commence some years before 1914, not later than 1910, reaching its climax in 1914. In 1904, however, just 10 years before 1914, Russell altered his view on this matter. In an article in the July 1st, 1904 issue of Zion's Watchtower entitled Universal Anarchy, just before or after October 1914 AD. He argued that the time of trouble with its worldwide anarchy would begin after October 1914. Quote, "We now expect that the anarchistic culmination of the great time of trouble will precede the millennial blessings will be after October 1914 AD, very speedily thereafter, in our opinion, in an hour, suddenly, because our 40 years harvest ending October 1914 AD should not be expected to include the awful period of anarchy which the scriptures point out to be the fate of Christendom." End quote. This change caused some readers to think that there might be other errors in the chronological system too. One reader even suggesting that Bishop Ussher's chronology might be more correct, when it dated the destruction of Jerusalem as having happened in 587 BCE rather than in 606 BCE. This would end the 2,520 years in about 1934 instead of 1914, but Russell strongly reaffirmed his belief in the 1914 date, referring to other claimed time parallels pointing to it. Quote, "We know of no reason for changing a figure. To do so would spoil the harmonies and parallels so conspicuous between the Jewish and Gospel ages." Answering another reader, he said, "The harmony of the prophetic periods is one of the strongest proofs of the correctness of our Bible chronology. They fit together like the cogwheels of a perfect machine. To change the chronology even 1 year would destroy all this harmony. So accurately are the various proofs drawn together in the parallels between the Jewish and Gospel ages." End quote. These arguments were further backed up by articles written by the Edgar brothers of Scotland. Subheading, Growing Doubts. So in 1904, Russell was still as convinced of his dates as he was in 1889, when he wrote that the understanding of these time features was the sealing of the foreheads, mentioned at Revelation 7:3. As the 1914 date drew nearer, however, Russell became more and more cautious in his statements. Answering an inquiring Bible student in 1907, he said that we have never claimed our calculations to be infallibly correct. We've never claimed that they were knowledge, nor based upon indisputable evidence, facts, knowledge. Our claim has always been that they are based on faith. The dates no longer seemed to qualify as God's dates, as he had stated 13 years earlier. Now they might be fallible. Russell even considered the possibility that 1914 and 1915 could pass by with none of the expected events having occurred. Quote, "But let us suppose a case far from our expectations. Suppose that AD 1915 should pass with the world's affairs all serene, and with evidence that the very elect had not all been changed, and without the restoration of natural Israel to favor under the new covenant. What then? Would not that prove our chronology wrong? Yes, surely. And would not that prove a keen disappointment? Indeed it would. What a blow that would be! One of the strings of our harp would be quite broken. However, dear friends, our harp would still have all the other strings in tune, and that is what no other aggregation of God's people on earth could boast." End quote. Another point of uncertainty was whether a year 0 between 1 BCE and 1 CE was to be included in the calculation or not. This matter had been brought up by Russell as early as 1904, but gained an importance as the year 1914 approached. The 1914 date had been arrived at simply by subtracting 606 from 2520, but gradually it was realized that no year 0 is allowed for in our present calendar of era reckoning. Consequently, from October 1st, 606 BCE to the beginning of January 1st CE was only 605 years and 3 months, and from the beginning of January 1 CE to October 1914 was only 1,913 years and 9 months, making a total of 2,519 years, not 2,520. This would mean that the 2,520 years would end in October 1915, rather than October 1914. But when the war broke out in Europe in August 1914 apparently seemed ill-timed to correct this error, it was allowed to stand. By 1913, with 1914 on the doorstep, the cautiousness regarding that year had increased. In the article, Let Your Moderation Be Known, which appeared in the June 1st, 1913 issue of the Watchtower, Russell warned his readers against spending valuable time and energy in guessing what will take place this year, next year, etc. His confidence in his earlier published scheme of events was no longer evident. This is the good tidings of God's grace in Christ, whether the completion of the church shall be accomplished before 1914 or not. He expressed himself still more vaguely in the October 15 issue of the same year. We are waiting for the time to come when the government of this world will be turned over to Messiah. We cannot say that it may not be either October 1914 or October 1915. It is possible that we might be out of the correct reckoning on the subject a number of years. We cannot say with certainty. We do not know. It is a matter of faith and not of knowledge. Earlier, 1914 had been one of God's dates, and to change the chronology even 1 year would destroy all this harmony. But now they might be out of the correct reckoning on the subject of a number of years, and nothing on the matter could be said with certainty. This was truly a volte-face. If it was indeed a matter of faith, one can only wonder in what or in whom that faith was to be based. Russell's own tottering faith in his chronology was further brought to light in the Watchtower of January 1st, 1914, in which he stated, "As already pointed out, we are by no means confident that this year 1914 will witness as radical and swift changes of dispensation as we have expected." The article, "The Days Are at Hand," in the same issue is especially revealing. Quote, "If later it should be demonstrated that the church is not glorified by October 1914, we shall try to feel content with whatever the Lord's will may be. If 1915 should go by without the passage of the church, without the time of trouble, etc., it would seem to be a great calamity to some. It would not be so with ourselves. If in the Lord's providence the time should come 25 years later, then that would be our will. If October 1915 should pass and we find ourselves still here and matters going on very much as they are at present, and the world apparently making progress in the way of settling disputes, and there were no time of trouble in sight, and the nominal church were not yet federated, etc., we would say that evidently we have been out somewhere in our reckoning. In that event, we would look over the prophecies further to see if we could find an error. And then we would think, have we been expecting the wrong thing in the right time? The Lord's will might permit this." End quote. Again, in the May 1st, 1914 issue, forgetting his earlier statements about God's dates and of Bible evidence proving that the predicted developments would occur in 1914, Russell told his readers in these columns and in these 6 volumes of studies in the Scriptures, we have set forth everything appertaining to the times and seasons in a tentative form. That is to say, not with positiveness, not with the claim that we knew, but merely with the suggestion that thus and so seems to be the teaching of the Bible. 2 months later, Russell seemed to be on the point of rejecting his chronology altogether. Answering a coal porter who wanted to know if the studies in the Scriptures were to be circulated after October 1914, "Since you, Russell, have some doubts respecting the full accomplishment of all expected by or before October 1914, Russell replied, "It is our thought that these books will be on sale and read for years in the future, provided the gospel age and its work continue. We have not attempted to say that these views are infallible, but have stated the processes of reasoning and figuring, leaving to each reader the duty and privilege of reading, thinking, and figuring for himself. That will be an interesting matter for 100 years from now. And if he can figure and reason better, he will still be interested in what we have presented." Thus, by July 1914, Russell now seemed ready to accept the thought that the 1914 date probably was a failure, and that his writings on the matter were going to be merely of historical interest to Bible students 100 years later. Subheading: Reactions to the Outbreak of the War. With the outbreak of the war in Europe in August 1914, Russell's wavering confidence in the chronology began to recover. Although the war itself did not exactly fit into the predicted pattern of events, that the time of trouble would be a class struggle between capital and labor, leading up to a period of worldwide anarchy, he saw in the war the prelude to that situation. Quote, socialism is, we believe, the main factor in the war now raging, and which will be Earth's greatest and most terrible war, and probably the last. Later in 1914, he wrote, we think that the present distress amongst the nations is merely the beginning of this time of trouble. The anarchy that will follow this war will be the real time of trouble. Our thought is that the war will so weaken the nations that following it there will be an attempt to bring in socialistic ideas, and that this will be met by the governments, etc., leading up to the worldwide class struggle and anarchy. Like other millenarian authors, Russell believed that the expiration of the Gentile times would mean a restoration of the Jewish nation in Palestine. Toward the end of 1914, however, Palestine and Jerusalem were still occupied by Gentiles. It seemed obvious that the restoration would not begin to occur in 1914, as had been predicted. In the November 1st issue of the Watchtower, therefore, Russell tried to reinterpret the end of the Gentile times to mean the end of the persecution of the Jews. Quote, the treading down of the Jews has stopped. All over the world, the Jews are now free, even in Russia. On September 5, the Tsar of Russia issued a proclamation to all the Jews of the Russian Empire, and this was before the times of the Gentiles had expired. It stated that the Jews might have access to the highest rank in the Russian army, and that the Jewish religion was to have the same freedom as any other religion in Russia. Where are the Jews being trodden down now? Where are they being subjected to scorn? At present, they are receiving no persecution whatsoever. We believe that the treading down of Jerusalem has ceased, because the time for the Gentiles to tread down Israel has ended. End quote. However, the relief for the Jews in Russia and elsewhere referred to by Russell turned out to be only temporary. He could not, of course, foresee the forthcoming fierce persecution of the Jews in Germany, Poland, and other countries during the Second World War. From the outbreak of the First World War and up to his death in October 1916, Russell's restored confidence in his chronology remained unshaken, as demonstrated by the following extracts from various issues of the Watchtower during the period. From January 1st, 1915, the war is the one predicted in the scriptures as associated with the great day of Almighty God, the day of vengeance of our God. September 15, 1915. Tracing the scriptural chronology down to our day, we find that we are now living in the very dawn of the great seventh day of man's great week. This is abundantly corroborated by the events now taking place about us on every hand. February 15, 1916. In Studies in the Scriptures, Volume 4, we have clearly pointed out the things now transpiring and the worst conditions yet to come. April 15, 1916. We believe that the dates have proven to be quite right. We believe that Gentile times have ended, and that God is now allowing the Gentile governments to destroy themselves in order to prepare the way for Messiah's kingdom. September 1st, 1916. It still seems clear to us that the prophetic period known to us as the times of the Gentiles ended chronologically in October 1914. The fact that the great day of wrath upon the nations began there marks a good fulfillment of our expectations. In November 1918, however, the First World War suddenly ended, without being followed by a worldwide socialist revolution and anarchy, as had been predicted. The last member of the divinely recognized Church of Christ had not been glorified, the city of Jerusalem was still being controlled by the Gentiles, the kingdom of God had not crushed the Gentile image, and the new heavens and the new earth could not be seen anywhere by trouble-tossed humanity. Not a single one of the 7 predictions enumerated in the book, The Time is at Hand, had come true. Pastor Russell's Bible students were confused, to say the least. Yet, though not among the predictions, something had happened: the World War. Could it be that the time was right, after all, even though the predictions had failed? The explanation resorted to by the Adventists after 1844 and by Barber and his associates after 1874, that they had expected the wrong thing at the right time, now seemed even more appropriate. But how could the time be right when all predictions based on it had failed? For years, many of Russell's followers experienced deep perplexity because of the non-arrival of the predicted events. After the lapse of some years, J.F. Rutherford, Russell's successor as president of the Watchtower Society, began to explain step by step what really had been fulfilled from 1914 onward. In the address, The Kingdom of Heaven is at Hand, at the September 5 through 13, 1922 Cedar Point Convention, Rutherford told his audience that the kingdom of God really had been established in 1914, not on earth, but in the invisible heavens. And 3 years later, in 1925, he applied Revelation 12 to this event, stating that God's kingdom was born in heaven in 1914 according to this prophecy. Previously, the Watchtower's predictions had all been of an obvious, clearly visible takeover of Earth's rulership by Christ. Now this was presented as something invisible, evident only to a select group. Also at the Cedar Point Convention in 1922, Rutherford for the first time presented the view that in 1918 or thereabouts, the Lord came to his spiritual temple. Earlier, Russell and his associates had held the view that the heavenly resurrection took place in 1878, but in 1927, Rutherford transferred that event to 1918. Likewise, in the early 1930s, Rutherford changed the date for the beginning of Christ's invisible presence from 1874 to 1914. Thus, Rutherford gradually replaced the unfulfilled predictions with a series of invisible and spiritual events associated with the years 1914 and 1918. 90 years after 1914, Rutherford's explanations are still held by Jehovah's Witnesses. Subheading: Summary. The interpretation of the Gentile times as having been of 2,520 years, beginning in 607 BCE, or earlier 606 BCE, and ending in 1914 CE, was not some divine revelation made to Pastor Charles Taze Russell in the autumn of 1876. On the contrary, this idea has a long history of development with its roots far back in the past. It had its origin in the year-day principle first posited by Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph in the 1st century CE. From the 9th century onward, this principle was applied to the time periods of Daniel by several Jewish rabbis. Among Christians, Joachim of Flores in the 12th century probably was the first to pick up the idea, applying it to the 1,260 days of Revelation and the 3½ times of Daniel. After Joachim's death, his followers soon identified the 1,260-year period with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. And this interpretation was then common among groups including the Reformers, branded as heretics by the Church of Rome during the following centuries. As time passed and expectations failed, when earlier explanations proved to be wrong, the starting point of the 1,260 or 1,290 years was progressively moved forward in order to make them end in a then near future. The first to arrive at a period of 2,520 years was apparently John Aquila Brown in 1823. Although his calculation was founded upon the 7 times of Daniel 4, he did not equate those periods with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. But this was very soon done by other expositors. Fixing the starting point at 604 BCE, Brown reached the year 1917 as the 7 times termination date. By using different starting points, other biblical commentators in the following decades arrived at a number of different terminal dates. Some writers who experimented with biblical jubilee cycles arrived at a period of 2,450 or 2,452 years, which is 49 times 49 plus 49, which they held to be the period of the Gentile times. The accompanying table presents a selection of applications of the 2,520 and 2,450 years made by different authors during the last century. The calculations were in fact so numerous that it would probably be difficult to find a single year between the 1830s and 1930s that does not figure in some calculation as the terminal date of the Gentile times. That a number of expositors pointed to 1914 or other years near to that date, such as 1915 or 16 or 17 or 18, 19, 22, 23, is therefore not a cause for astonishment. The 1914 date would most probably have drowned in the sea of other failed dates and been forgotten by now had it not happened to be the year of the outbreak of the First World War. When back in 1844 E.B. Elliott suggested 1914 as a possible terminal date for the Gentile times, he reckoned the 2,520 years from Nebuchadnezzar's accession year, which he dated to 606 BCE. N.H. Barber, however, reckoned the 2,520 years from the desolation of Jerusalem in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th regnal year, but as he dated this event to 606 BCE, he too, in 1875, arrived at 1914 as the terminal date. Since their chronologies not only conflicted with each other, but also conflicted with the historically established chronology for Nebuchadnezzar's reign, their arriving at the same terminal year was simply a coincidence, demonstrating how arbitrary and gratuitous their calculations really were. Barber's calculation was accepted by C.T. Russell at their meeting in 1876. Barber was then 52 years old, while Russell was 24, still very young. Although their ways parted again in the spring of 1879, Russell stuck to Barber's time calculations, and since that time, the 1914 date has been the pivotal point in prophetic explanations among Russell's followers. Subheading Supplement to the Third and Later Editions, Chapter 1. The information presented in this chapter has been available to the Jehovah's Witnesses since 1983, when the first edition of this book was published. In addition, the same information was summarized by Raymond Franz in Chapter 7 of his widely known work, Crisis of Conscience, published in the same year. Thus, after 10 years, in 1993, the Watchtower Society finally felt compelled to admit that neither the 2,520-year calculation nor the 1914 date originated with Charles Taze Russell, as it had held until then. Further, the Society now also admits that the predictions Russell and his associates attached to 1914 failed. These admissions are found on pages 134 to 137 of Jehovah's Witnesses' Proclaimers of God's Kingdom, a book on the history of the movement published by the Watchtower Society in 1993. Prior to 1993, the impression given had been that Russell was the first to publish the 2,520-year calculation pointing to 1914, doing this for the first time in the October 1876 issue of George Storr's magazine, The Bible Examiner. Also, that decades in advance, Russell and his followers foretold the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and other events associated with the war. Thus, the earlier organizational history book, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose, quoted some very general statements made in the book The Plan of the Ages, published in 1886, about the time of trouble originally believed to extend from 1874 to 1914, and claimed, quote, although this was still decades before the First World War, it is surprising how accurately the events that finally took place were actually foreseen. End quote. Similarly, the Watchtower of August 1st, 1971, made the following pretentious statements on page 468. From the Bible chronology, Jehovah's Witnesses, as far back as 1877, pointed to the year 1914 as one of great significance. The momentous year of 1914 came, and with it World War I, the most widespread upheaval in history up to that time. It brought unprecedented slaughter, famine, pestilence, and overthrow of governments. The world did not expect such horrible events as took place. But Jehovah's Witnesses did expect such things, and others acknowledged that they did. How could Jehovah's Witnesses have known so far in advance what world leaders themselves did not know? Only by God's Holy Spirit making such prophetic truths known to them. True, some today claim that those events were not hard to predict, since mankind has long known various troubles. But if those events were not hard to predict, then why were not all the politicians, religious leaders, and economic experts doing so? Why were they telling the people the opposite? End quote. Unfortunately for the Watchtower Society, none of these claims are in accordance with the facts of history. Whether deliberate or the result of ignorance, each represents a serious distortion of reality. Firstly, although there were a number of predictions in the Watchtower publications as to what would take place in 1914, none of them came close to a prediction of the outbreak of a world war in that year. Secondly, political and religious leaders, contrary to the statements in the Watchtower quoted above, long before 1914, expected that a great war sooner or later would break out in Europe. As early as 1871, Otto von Bismarck, the first Lord High Chancellor of the German Empire, declared that the Great War would come one day. For decades before 1914, the daily papers and weeklies were constantly occupied with the theme. To cite just one example among many, the January 1892 issue of the highly respected English weekly Black and White explained in an editorial introduction to a fictional serial on the coming war. The air is full of rumors of war. The European nations stand fully armed and prepared for instant mobilization. Authorities are agreed that a great war must break out in the immediate future, and that this war will be fought under novel and surprising conditions. All facts seem to indicate that the coming conflict will be the bloodiest in history and must involve the momentous consequences to the whole world. At any time, the incident may occur, which will precipitate this disaster. I.F. Clarke, in his book Voices Prophesying War, 1763 to 1984, explains to what an extent the First World War was being prepared in fact and in fiction. Quote, from 1871 onwards, the major European powers prepared for the great war that Bismarck had said would come one day. And for close on half a century, while the generals, staffs, and ministries argued about weapons, estimates, and tactics, the tale of the war to come was a dominant device in the field of purposive fiction. The period from the 1880s to the long-expected outbreak of the next war in 1914 saw the emergence of the greatest number of these tales of coming conflicts ever to appear in European fiction. End quote. The people of that time, therefore, could not avoid being confronted with the constant predictions of a coming great war in Europe. The question was not if, but when the Great War would break out. Here there was room for speculations, and many of the imaginative tales and novels suggested different dates. Specific dates were sometimes even pointed out in the very titles of the books. For example, Europa in Flammen, Der Deutsche, translated into English, Europe in Flames, The Coming German War of 1909, by Michael Wagewold, published in 1908, and The Invasion of 1910, by W. Lecroix, published in 1906. Politicians and statesmen, too, sometimes tried to pinpoint the specific year for the outbreak of the expected Great War. One of the more lucky was M. Francis de Lacy, a member of the French Chamber of Deputies. In his article La Guerre qui vient, The Coming War, published in the Paris periodical La Guerre Sociale in 1911, he discusses at great length the diplomatic situation, concluding that, quote, a terrible war between England and Germany is preparing, end quote. As shown by the following extracts from his article, some of his political forecasts turned out to be remarkably accurate. Quote, a conflict is preparing itself, compared with which the horrible slaughter of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905 will be child's play. In 1914, the naval forces of England and Germany will be almost equal. A Prussian army corps will advance with forced marches to occupy Antwerp. We, the French, will have to do the fighting on the Belgian plains. All newspapers will print in headlines as large as your hand these prophetic words: the Belgian neutrality has been violated. The Prussian army is marching upon Lille. End quote. In the religious area, it was especially the millenarians that were then presenting predictions of the approaching end of the world. This movement included millions of Christians from different quarters, Baptists, Pentecostals, and so on. Pastor Russell and his followers, the Bible students, were just a small branch of this broad movement. Common to them all was their pessimistic view of the future. In his book, Armageddon Now, Dwight Wilson describes their reaction to the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Quote, the war itself came as no shock to these opponents of post-millennial optimism. They had not only looked toward the culmination of the age in Armageddon, but anticipated wars and rumors of wars as signs of the approaching end. End quote. Wilson then goes on to quote one of them, R.A. Torrey, dean of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, who in 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of the war, wrote in his book, The Return of the Lord Jesus, we talk of disarmament, but we all know it is not coming. All our present peace plans will end in the most awful wars and conflicts this old world ever saw. As Theodore Graebner tells in his book, War and the Light of Prophecy, the War of 1914 had scarcely begun before a great host of writers from different religious quarters arose, claiming that the war had been foretold. Quote, soon the announcement was made by several investigators. It has been foretold. Immediately, thousands of Bible Christians became interested. Immediately, too, others set to work on Gog and Magog, Armageddon, the 70 weeks, 666, 1260, etc., and soon religious periodicals in this country and abroad contained the message announced with greater or less assurance, it has been foretold. Pamphlets and tracts appeared promulgating the same message, and soon a number of books were on the market running to 350 pages each, which not only contained most circumstantial proof for this assertion, but announced likewise the exact time when the war would come to a close, who would be the victor, and the significance of the war for the Christian church, now, it was said, about to enter into her millennial period. End quote. Graebner, who felt incited to examine a great number of these contentions, after a very thorough investigation, concludes that, quote, the entire mass of millennial literature that flourished during the First World War, and a tremendous mass it was proved definitely, completely, absolutely false by the events. And not a single point did the First World War develop as was to be expected after reading the chiliastic millennialist interpreters. Not a single one of them predicted the outcome of the war. Not a single one of them foretold the entrance of the United States. Not a single one of them foretold World War II. End quote. Pastor Russell's speculations about the coming Great War in Europe did not differ appreciably from those of the contemporary novel writers and millenarian expositors. In the Zion's Watchtower of February 1885, he wrote, "Storm clouds are gathering thick over the old world. It looks as though a great European war is one of the possibilities of the near future." Commenting on the prevailing world situation 2 years later, he concluded in the issue of February 1887, "This all looks as though next summer, 1888, would see a war on foot which might engage every nation of Europe." In the issue of January 15, 1892, he had postponed the war to about 1905, at the same time stressing that this generally expected Great War had nothing to do with 1914 and the expectations attached to that date. In 1914, he expected not a general European war, but the climax of the Battle of Armageddon, which he thought had begun in 1874, when all the nations on earth would be crushed and be replaced by the kingdom of God. He wrote, "The daily papers and the weeklies and the monthlies, religious and secular, are continually discussing the prospects of war in Europe. They note the grievances and ambitions of the various nations and predict that war is inevitable at no distant day, that it may begin at any moment between some of the great powers, and that the prospects are that it will eventually involve them all. But notwithstanding these predictions and the good reasons which many see for making them, we do not share them. That is, we do not think that the prospects of a general European war are so marked as is commonly supposed. Even should a war or revolution break out in Europe sooner than 1905, we do not consider it any portion of the severe trouble predicted. The ever-darkening war cloud will burst in all its destructive fury. This culmination we do not expect, however, before about 1905, as the events predicted will require about that time, notwithstanding the rapid progress in these directions now possible." End quote. The generally expected Great War finally came in 1914, but probably none, and in any case not Charles Taze Russell and his followers, had predicted that it would come that year. The very different events that he and his associated Bible students had attached to that date did not occur. Like the predictions of the many other contemporary millenarian writers, their predictions too were proved definitely, completely, absolutely false by the events. To claim afterwards, as the Watchtower Society repeatedly did up to 1993, that they, and they alone, accurately, by God's Holy Spirit, had predicted the outbreak of the war in 1914 and other events, and that all the politicians, religious leaders, and economic experts had been telling the people the opposite, is demonstrably an outright lie. As explained earlier, some of those pretentious claims were finally, in 1993, withdrawn in the new book Jehovah's Witnesses, Proclaimers of God's Kingdom. The book was introduced at the district assemblies of Jehovah's Witnesses that year as a candid look at the history of the movement. The admissions, however, usually are contextually surrounded by a minimum of background information, which, moreover, is so apologetically slanted and warped that it often conceals more than it reveals. True, the Society finally admits that Russell took over his calculation of the Gentile times from Nelson H. Barber, who had published it 1 year before Russell in the August, September, and October 1875 issues of the Herald of the Morning. In the preceding paragraph, the book even seeks to enlist the 19th century expositors of the 2,520-year calculation as supporting the 1914 date. This impression is further enhanced by the bold-typed statement to the left of the paragraph. They could see that 1914 was clearly marked by Bible prophecy. The presentation of the history, however, is narrowly limited to a few carefully selected expositors, the calculations of whom are partially obscured, adjusted, and arranged so as to create the impression that the 2,520-year calculation uniquely pointed forward to 1914. None of the many other terminal dates arrived at by expositors before Russell are mentioned. Thus, although John A. Brown is stated to have arrived at the 2,520 years as early as 1823, his particular application of the period is completely veiled and distorted in the subsequent sentences. But he did not clearly discern the date with which the prophetic time period began or when it would end. He did, however, connect these 7 times with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. Quite to the contrary, as shown in the chapter above, Brown expressly stated as his firm conviction that the 2,520-year period began in 604 BCE and would end in 1917, Further, despite this society's italicized statement, Brown did not connect the 2,520 years with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24, because as pointed out in the chapter above, he held the Gentile times referred to in this text to be 1,260 lunar years, not 7 times of 2,520 years. Both statements about Brown's calculation, then, are demonstrably false. In addition to John A. Brown, the society in the same paragraph refers to Edward B. Elliot and Robert Seeley, both of whom mention 1914 as one of the possible dates for the end of the 7 times. Both of them, however, actually preferred 1793, later changed to 1791 by Elliot as the terminal date. Finally, an unnamed publication edited by Joseph Seiss and others is stated to have set out calculations that pointed to 1914 as a significant date, even though the reasoning it contained was based on chronology that C.T. Russell later rejected. The fact is, however, that this holds true of all 4 expositors mentioned by the Society. All of them used a chronology that dated the desolation of Jerusalem to 588 or 587 BCE, not 606 BCE, as in Russell's writings. Brown arrived at 1917 as the terminal date only because he reckoned the 2,520 years from the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, 604 BCE, instead of his 18th year, as did Barber and Russell. And the other 3 arrived at 1914 by counting from Nebuchadnezzar's accession year, which they dated to 606 BCE, instead of 605 BCE, the date established by modern historians. Although all of them based their calculations on chronologies that were rejected by Russell and his followers, the Society claims that these expositors could see that 1914 was clearly marked by Bible prophecy. How they could see this clearly by using chronologies that the Society still holds to be false is certainly puzzling. Of course, for a reader to discover such inconsistent reasonings, he or she has to check the works of these expositors. The problem is that the Society's authors commonly avoid giving specific references. This practice makes it virtually impossible for the great majority of readers to discover the subtle methods used to support indefensible interpretations and cover over embarrassing evidence. As just mentioned, the Society, contrary to earlier claims, concedes in the new book that the predictions attached to 1914 failed. As was shown in the chapter above, the very specific and distinct predictions about 1914 were summarized in 7 points on pages 76 through 78 of Volume 2 of Millennial Dawn, originally published in 1889. These predictions were there put forward in no uncertain terms. The discussion is teeming with words and phrases such as facts, proof, Bible evidence, and established truth. That 1914 would see the disintegration of the rule of imperfect men, for instance, is stated to be a fact firmly established by the Scriptures. What does the Society's new history book do with the pretentious claims and the very positive language that originally encapsulated these predictions? They are totally smoothed over or concealed. Referring to the above-mentioned discussion of the Gentile times in Volume 2 of Millennial Dawn, but without quoting any of the actual statements made, the Society asks, but what would the end of the Gentile times mean? The surprising answer given is that the Bible students were not completely sure what would happen. Although some of the predictions are briefly mentioned, the Society carefully avoids terming them predictions or prophecies. Russell and his associates never predicted or foretold anything, never claimed to present proof or establish truth. They just thought, suggested, expected, and earnestly hoped that this or that might happen, but they were not completely sure. Thus, the predictions are wrapped up in language that completely masks the true nature of the aggressive doomsday message proclaimed to the world by the International Bible Students for over a quarter of a century before 1914. Disguising the presumptuous predictions in such vague and unassuming words and phrases, of course, makes it easier to humbly concede that these failed.